getting into this subject of this video, we should look first at how Google effectively writes laws. Now, the laws that Google writes are what some might refer to as de facto laws, or of the fact, which basically means that they might not be legitimate laws, but they are what is practiced. The reason why this happens is because when you go to Google and you look something up, especially when it concerns the law, Google often manipulates search results to one particular side, effectively warping the perspective of the Google user or searcher into believing that what Google states is the law is in fact the law, because that's all that Google presents. It would require specific surrounding or background knowledge for a person to know that what Google is saying is a lie, or what it's promoting. Google is not directly saying it's what it's promoting. And that would require the individual to go to the source and discover what it is. There are not that many that would do that, and therefore the majority of people will simply go to Google, take the Google results as the answer, and thus Google writes de facto laws. Now, but before we get into the financial way, or the financial ramifications of how Google does this, first, if we look up, is immigration mentioned in the US Constitution? Google will present the National Geographic's answer as if the National Geographic is the one that can define laws. And of course, it states the United States Constitution does not define a federal power over immigration. That's a lie. It does. Yet courts have deemed it a plenary power of a sovereign nation. That's super vague, and I'm sure the sovereign nation they're referring to right now is the Vatican. United States immigration law has been developed extensively, often free of judicial review. That immigration law they're referring to is actually regulation or policy, which comes from the United Nations, which obviously is very well connected with the Vatican. It's not actually a law, considering in the United States, at least, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it actually does stipulate. Of course, in the other results, if you look up U.S. immigration law, it will say things like foreigners, or that it will begrudgingly admit that the Constitution defines the charge of establishing a uniform rule of naturalization to foreigners that enter the United States and wish to become U.S. citizens. That is all. So it will begrudgingly state that, but then it will say that foreigners are subject to immigration law. That's subject like subjected, or subject as in a king's subject. However, the immigration law is not, in fact, a law. It's regulation or policy. And the people that are enforcing it often are not sworn as judicial or executive officers, so they have no authority to do it, one. Second, the Constitution states that all laws not stipulated in it are left to the people and the states, not to the executive branch of the federal government to establish this UN border protection and all this other garbage, because they have to protect their immigration system, because it provides them a physical leash over foreigners that they can wield against the people of the United States. That is obviously the intent. And so hence they have to protect the sanctity of their immigration law above all else, because it provides them not only monetary resources to wage operations of war and other things against the people, to violate the Constitution and put the UN laws and all these other things above it, but it also gives them human resources in the foreigners. The foreigners they can wield against the people, as well as take money from them and resources and things like that. So it always comes down to a monetary and fiduciary sphere, where it has to do with the movement of resources. So that's what this is all about. And also, when we get into Google's barter laws, it will naturally, at least this is DuckDuckGo, but then again, all search engines are basically Google, especially considering Google's Alphabet, which is a federal agency. Go figure. So the research results in DuckDuckGo for bartering, which you'll find is very similar with Google. It states that in so many words, all of the hits basically here, they all state the same thing around barter laws, which is that according to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, also an unconstitutional entity, that if you engage in barter, that you have to, that it's quote, each transaction is taxable income to both parties. So they would have somebody who goes and trades with their next door neighbor, nickel and dime every little trade they do. So basically, if you have two kids that trade Yu-Gi-Oh cards, well, according to the tax man, they are supposed to record the value of those two items and then pay for the service, I suppose, or for the privilege of bartering, something that is obviously, practically speaking, what people do every day. And it's interesting because you'll have these people running around touting immigration law and all these other things, and they don't care about the Constitution, clearly. And yet those same people would get irritated when they came across these barter laws. So the question is, why would you want to follow an entity that wants to nickel and dime your Yu-Gi-Oh or baseball card trades and enforce, actually physically, in practicality, de facto enforce their other laws or any of their laws? Because their laws are not laws, because the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. Their laws are only regulations. They're subordinate and therefore cannot be enforced under the Constitution. When it comes to the immigration officials, just barring the idea of them carrying out military operations against U.S. citizens and against the Constitution, just separate from that, if I was on a jury doing due process to any of these immigration officers, I would probably be a proponent of the death penalty for many of them, because I have actually seen how these people abuse and treat other people. And as far as deprivation of rights under color of law, which is what a lot of them do, the death penalty is perfectly reasonable. And with some of these people, I think it's warranted. Many, actually, not just some, many of them. But that would obviously require due process, far beyond just my opinion. Now, of course, this gets into the idea of financing, because how do they carry out these operations? How is it that they seem to be able to write de facto law everywhere, and they get to explain away the Constitution to the benefit of UN regulations and other such foreign entities foreign to the US and around the globe? How do they set up this system? That's where you come down to the movement of resources and fundraising. As anyone would, practically speaking, be aware, when it comes to an operation of any sort, if you want to do something, you have to get funds to do it. If you want to build a business, you need funds to purchase supplies and materials and pay employees and all that. So that requires fundraising. Now, they do practice fundraising in a variety of ways, but the most obvious is through fraud. Fraud, of course, is not directly defined in the Constitution or many other places, and I'm not entirely certain if it's a new word or an old one. But the basic concept of fraud is theft, and it is depriving somebody of their property in an unlawful way, using tricks and things like that. Hence why that clause in deprivation of rights refers to not just liberty, but also property, and not just life either. So with immigration people, they could end up depriving people of property and liberty, and in some cases life, without due process. So to start out with this concept of the fraud operations that run around, or that are in conduct today for the purpose of raising money for this global system, we will look at first an article in Forbes magazine, which was published on December 11th, 2022. It's titled "E-commerce bots boosting prices, causing shortages and taking advantage of crises." Now, this article is highly propagandistic, but it does present us a straightforward viewpoint of this idea of bot boosting, which is fraud. It states that it can be everything from baby formula, work permits, reservations for vaccinations. Soderman told me in a recent Tech First podcast, these bots snap them up, buy them at $400 and resell at $1,000, and basically put $600 in their pockets. While that explanation is very rudimentary, all that we're looking to do there is see how it is being addressed, the idea of bot boosting, which has been around for a long time, and now the propagandists are being forced to recognize it as a real thing in some areas. In other areas, they still refuse to recognize the element of bot boosting, especially when it comes to social media outlets. But in this article, it also states that it becomes very clear that it is getting more and more organized. Soderman says, and I think that the largest incorporated company doing this here has at least 200 employees, many sitting offshore, meaning in lower salary countries in Asia, and are helping on doing all this here. What he's talking about is a company of people whose only job is to generate programs and bot boost things. And of course, he's taken a very obfuscatory approach and viewpoint, but it is at least recognizing that bot boosting is an issue, which is not something you find a lot when it comes to propaganda outlets. Now, if we come to Twitter, the subject of Twitter, which has been severely bot boosted, we will find that most of the Google hits will talk about how 5% of accounts on Twitter are robots. That is incredibly unlikely, but the reason why you only get one perspective on Google is because Google is doing what it always does, which is filter results to one side so that it can essentially set de facto information. In this case, not a law, but information. So, according to Google, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that nothing untoward is going on at Twitter. And that only 5% of their accounts are bots. Now, if you go to another link or a article that is being highly obfuscatory, the only hit basically on Google puts that number up to 8%. And that's under the article, the Twitter reveals how many active users are bots. The number may be higher than you think. Of course, that is clearly written by some propagandist from a university, because the wording there is assuming much of the reader and the reader's intelligence. Very condescending. But it says that a report from the Securities and Exchange Commission, that's a trustworthy outlet, indicates that as much as 8.5% of Twitter's monthly active users are bots. I would personally put that number a lot higher. But in a different article, we get one of the few differing perspectives to this very low percentage of bot users on Twitter. And they call it or it called it the Botmageddon, and this was posted on January. This article states that Twitter hid its source code from public view days after the code was cited as evidence of automation among some of the bot-like accounts that suddenly came into existence last month during a phenomenon dubbed Botmageddon by users who were affected by it. The mysterious Twitter accounts followed prominent Southeast Asia-based users by the thousands, arousing skepticism about the company's recent pledge to eliminate spam and prompting calls for greater transparency, blah, blah, blah. So that's the usual. That does note the skeevy tactics at Twitter, but I would posit that all of the social media outlets are bot boosted. One of the purposes behind that is not the monetary snatching up of money, as was listed, and then reselling it, or price gouging. That's the term for that, is price gouging. But instead, the bot boosting of the social media outlets is to impart the view of popularity, similar to Taylor Swift concert tickets, where they were all bought by robots, likely connected with the scheme, so there wasn't actually any money changing hands. It's like if you had a certain amount of money in your bank account, and then you submit a product, and then you take your money and you buy up all your own product, then you're not losing any money. That's the same concept. If they put forward these ticket sales that are theirs, and then they buy up all their tickets, well, then obviously they're not losing any money. But it does impart the perspective of popularity, that these things are popular because somebody's going through the effort to instigate a fraud. Same thing with social media websites. The amount of traffic that goes through the social media websites, a lot of it is of robots, which has become even more apparent today. But all of that traffic is with the intent of causing the perspective that certain social media websites are more popular over others because of the traffic going through them. But of course, they have other schemes to set up certain social media website dominance, such as forcing it on people in universities and government agencies and other corporations and whatnot, just like they force people to use certain software and drive everything else out of the market. Of course, if we go to the Twitter files, we can find a lot more evidence of these skeevy tactics. But one of the main important takeaways from the Twitter files is that the different corporate government outlets acting under the color of law, they push the Russia collusion lie, and they do everything in their power to make that valid, while admittedly censoring and removing truthful information. So they are attempting, in fact, to establish a lie, and then they are going around and saying that what's truth is a lie. Well, that's what you expect from liars, but also fraudsters and, of course, enemies. Definitely enemies of the Constitution, but enemies of the people as well, in practicality. Another thing that they do is that they establish conspiracy against rights among all of the so-called big tech companies, which means that they are all, in fact, working together as part of the same organization. And if they do conduct these systems of fraud and whatnot, they're doing so in an inclusionary manner, so it's an operation. And some of the different ways that they raise funds for this operation can be found in what some might refer to as economic war, but a lot of it has to do with frauds. And one of the first frauds that you can look at, the major ones, is the stock exchange. That has a long history of fraud with Ponzi schemes and, well, with the Ponzi scheme, a guy named Ponzi, and another guy, I don't remember his name, But you had many individuals that were set up as scapegoats for stock exchange fraud schemes, and those were for raising money. Of course, the current example of this is the FTX scheme today. But the E-Trade scheme, that has a obvious collusionary connection that can be established with the Vatican, with the Vatican's promotion of the E-Trade system. And these schemes, what they do is some of them are bot boosted, especially nowadays, but the stock exchange is arguably older than robots. Well, what they do is they go around and they promote this product, just like with Bitcoin, so that they raise its value and they get people to invest in it and do all those other things, except it has nothing to do with value. What it has to do with is you basically go around and you promote a bank account, and people put money into that bank account, and you control that bank account. That's it. That's all it is. They go around and they get people to put money into trade stock accounts. They go around and they get people to put money into a cryptocurrency. And then they take their money out of it, and those people lose all their money. Well, that's obviously simply described as people put money into your bank account, and that's your money. That's what they do. That's obviously fraud, but anyway. Another thing that has been done and appears to be in the works today is the concept of dumping. The Standard Oil Company used this concept of dumping in a very specific manner, and that was to buy up other oil companies. So, during the volatile time, if you go to Titan, the biography of John D. Rockefeller Sr., it will stipulate that the reason for the volatile oil prices was because you had companies that would spring up and discover oil, and then they would flood the market, and that would raise the price. After they ran dry of oil, then the price would go up again. So you had a volatile price in oil. Practically speaking, though, if you look at not only the outcome, but the way that this operation was carried out, it becomes very apparent that this was not an organic volatility in the price. This was, in fact, dumping. Now, what happened with Standard Oil, and I don't believe it was Standard Oil specifically doing it, because there were many collusionary elements in this regard. What they were doing is they were hoarding oil, and then they would release enough into the market to drive the price down so that other oil companies could make profit. And they do one of two things. Either they go to that person and they get them to sell their company to them at a loss, of course. Or they let that individual know that if they do not sell their company, they will keep the price low until they're driven out of business. The competition is driven out of business. Dumping is a very simple concept that has been established a long time ago. It's even referred to in the Levantine Adventure, and how the French merchants engage in cutthroat business tactics against each other and engage in dumping. That's dumping. Now, there is a certain blog which I came across on Substack, which mentioned something that sparked my interest in the concern of dumping. Now, this comes from an article from Rory Johnston on the Commodity Context, which is published January 20th, where it stated that the biggest number on the screen this week was the 8.4 MMBBL rise in the U.S. crude stocks, given still depressed domestic refining activity, which brought the total crude inflows in the first 2 weeks of the new year to a very high 27.4. So what that's stating is that the activity for refining is depressed, and also the price of oil is high. Yet, there's been a rise in quantity of inventory, which would lead to the conclusion that this entire time that the prices of things have been rising, oil is being guarded for the intent to dump. Now, because of the way that the corrupt have organized this world, everything is linked to oil. A lot of people would talk about the backing of the dollar, but that has nothing. Is a very small portion of it. It's just like how they talk about the value of valueless currency. It's obfuscation. It's an illusion, and they use various explanations to govern it. Now, one of the reasons why they can say that oil-backed money is the reason why inflation happens and why it goes down, what they call a petrodollar or fiat currency. The reason why they say that is because, practically speaking, the price of everything is run off oil because of transportation costs. Nearly everything across the globe is transported via the power of petroleum. We don't have electric trucks. And even if we did have electric trucks, a lot of those electric parts would be transported on petroleum-based vehicles. Every single thing across the planet is transported on petroleum-based vehicles. Naturally, the transportation costs will go up if the price of oil goes up. Equally, if the price of oil plummets, the price of everything plummets. That is the economic lever of oil, which has been established with this particular intent in mind. Of course, I don't actually believe that it is the corrupt doing it at this point, but that's just my own speculation. Either way, it does appear that there is going to be a huge dump coming in the future. The last part, before we move on to my own personal experience with this idea of spot the fraud, is when we look at the Pells. George Pell is a particularly disgraced cardinal from Australia who allegedly recently died of natural causes. Hopefully that's hanging or something along those lines. Natural death of asphyxiation. Anyway, there is the Pell Grant in the United States, named after Claiborne Pell, and then of course there are two, and then there's another member of Congress, or the fraudulent Congress at least, with the last name Pell. In the Ghislaine Maxwell case, it was stipulated that Epstein's victims were given high-end handbags, expensive items, and also positions in higher education. There is a direct link from that Maxwell case between pedophilia and the corrupt pedophile rings of the world today and higher education. Well, education in general. And considering George Pell is now unquestionably a pedophile, it coincides, but it is not an accident, or it probably isn't. It would need more concrete evidence, but it is likely not an accident that the Pell Grant exists as far as pedophilia goes. And that, of course, is another element of this global operational fraud scheme, which is intent to not only raise funds, but also provide monetary mechanisms. Now, in my own personal life, I've run into quite a few suspicious accounting errors. And when it comes to my book sales on Drafted to Digital, it stipulates recently that the books that I sold in December under books sold last month is 43. But when I went through the numbers and I added up them all myself, it gave me the realistic number, which is more around 100 and something, just on this website, mind you. Of course, this is not the only element of suspicious activity going on here, considering I sent them an email letting them know that their actions were possibly criminal. And I had an uptick in denials for publications. Now, this does one of two things. First of all, this violates the idea of exclusivity to authors, to their rights. But it, more importantly, impacts the customers. So if you're a person who buys a book, you do expect the proceeds of that purchase to go to the creator of that book, so that they will then not only know that their object has value, but they'll create more. These people, operating in bad faith, clearly, take the position in the middle, the middleman, and they deem to regulate what an author can present to a customer and what a customer can purchase from an author, so that the authors or the writers don't continue writing because they'll feel that they don't have any value. Not only that, though, it's not just a deprivation of exclusive rights, which is your intellectual property, but it's also deprivation of monetary value. And one can only wonder where that monetary value is going and what it is being used to fund. It'd be like if you donated money to feed starving children in Africa. Instead, that money was used for child trafficking, which a lot of evidence suggests that that is in fact the case. A lot of these church fundraising campaigns and donations are actually to fund really evil global operations for the corrupt, what some might call cabal. And of course, this gets in the concept of theft. And what exactly is theft? Well, it's said in so many different ways that you reap what you sow. A man has a right to the fruits of his labor, and many, many phrases to basically describe the same idea, which is that theft is wrong. And nowadays, you have nearly everything run by fraudsters that set up all of these expansive theft schemes. And the purpose of it is to actually raise funds for control and for dominance. Now, also, in my own personal experience, when it comes to the education system, when I was expelled from the Grand Canyon University on a rather ridiculous pretext, but they were definitely fraudulent charges, but either way, it was all done without due process, as always, because the high and mighty lords of the education system believe that they are above us mere mortals, and that they can deem from on high how they can abuse students and whatnot. So after I was expelled, naturally, for all kinds of different reasons, and possible, imagined, or otherwise, the Department of Veterans Affairs deducted time not spent at the university from my benefits. Now, what that tells me, considering I received no funds myself, is that the school received payments from the Department of Veterans Affairs and then took that money and ran with it. And the VA had the audacity to respond to my complaints that I published about this school by saying that they could not compel action from that institution. They essentially, whoever was involved in that scheme, all of them committed fraud. They defrauded the people that provide those funds for legitimate practice, and they took it for time not spent. So, and of course they can't compel action. Take of that what you will. If you enjoyed this content, please like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and check out anything else that I might have posted. And as always, stay tuned. There will be more to come.